Good evening, one and all. Welcome to our podcast, The Absolute Truth. My name is Greg, my co-host Christina, and we have a special guest with us tonight, Robert Ford. We're excited to get a chance to visit and share with you. So let's get started with our Did You Know segment. Christina?
So did you know, according to Daily Wire, a Virginia teacher was suspended for refusing to affirm trans identity kids. Schools called the response vindictive. He won temporary injunction, a massive victory for freedom of speech. The judge called the school system suspension unconstitutional, and handling of the situation, he considered it was vindictive. So that was a big victory for freedom of speech, which we all know that we're battling right now in this country, trying to maintain the freedom that we have with our First Amendment.
Yeah, we need more teachers to stand up to these rules that they seem to put in place.
Did you know that according to Daily Wire, the flag is also racist, along with everything else in this country today? The American flag is considered disturbing. Trump voters see Americanness as whiteness. I don't know about you listeners, but to me that's very absurd. Being a Trump supporter, I do not in any way, shape, or form consider the flag to be racist. I see it as a symbol of freedom, history, pride, principles. And if you research the flag, the red actually on the flag stands for bravery, and the white is for purity, and the blue is for vigilance, perseverance, and justice. Doesn't sound like a very racist flag, in my opinion. It also reminds me of every man and woman that fought and bled and died to preserve our freedoms. It's patriotic, and in my opinion, it is a symbol of unity. So I wish that everybody that thinks that every single thing in this country is racist anymore would get over themselves, because it's all complete and utter nonsense. Greg?
Yeah, I'd second that. All right, did you know Washington State approves free marijuana joints if you're vaccinated? That's according to the Daily Wire, June 7th of this year. Also, did you know Anheuser-Busch, the maker of Budweiser, they're promising free beer to the U.S. population if the nation reaches whose goal? The White House's goal of 70% of U.S. adults vaccinated by July 4th. Then free beer. Think about that. To me, that makes a prominent point. The dumbing down of America continues, and at the same time, there's a huge push for vaccinations. Why? Why such a huge push for these vaccinations? Never in our history have I ever seen such a push to get everybody vaccinated. Christina?
According to Newsmax, there's a school in New York, and it's actually the school that Anderson Cooper had attended, and it's the Dalton School. $55,000 per year they charge for tuition, and they decided that it was their responsibility to teach the kids in first grade sex ed and how to masturbate. Obviously, the parents were outraged, and they are fighting against the school. But this is literally what our school systems are coming to, where they think that is their responsibility to teach politics, sex ed, and all the things that really should come from the parents, not from teachers. Teachers need to learn their place, and their place is to educate kids on history, English, all those types of things. It certainly is not their place to force their agendas politically and their sexual agendas that are really trying to destroy this country onto our innocent children's minds. Also, according to Daily Wire, I think everybody's probably heard about the Palestinians in this country that are really attacking the Jews and killing them. Apparently, that's Trump's fault. Trump is kind of out of the limelight now, but he still seems to be getting the blame for everything that is wrong, and everything that isn't going well is always pointed back still to Trump. So I don't know how, but he's still responsible for the attacks on the Jews. Greg?
Okay, did you know that a reporter by the name of Hank Berrien of the Daily Wire, just I think today, June 8th, he put out an article that showed Yale had a guest speaker. Her name is Dr. Aruna Kilanani, and her talk was titled, check this out, The Psychotic Problem of the White Mind. She's a New York-based psychiatrist. She states that she fantasized about the unloading of a revolver into the head of any white person that got in my way, burying their body and wiping my bloody hands as I walked away relatively guiltless with a bounce in my step. Like I did the world an effing favor. Can you imagine? We have a prominent university like Yale who they just certainly don't cancel her speech out, and they even didn't really block this speech from being, I wouldn't say they promoted it, but they still made it available, yet we have Facebook and other prominent mainstream media who block our speech and our president's speech for years. My next Did You Know has to do with President Biden. This from Just the News. They reported June 2nd that President Biden says the most lethal threat to the United States now is terrorism from white supremacy. This was in a speech he was doing in Oklahoma. I mean, how many of our listeners truly believe that that's our biggest threat right now? White supremacy. Wake up, America, right? Don't stand idle. Get involved before it's too late. This is not okay. Again, not only dumbing down our citizens, but dividing them, right? Through the race, through the vaccine, through the mask, on and on. If we don't stand up and do something, you're not going to have America around much longer. Christina, did you have another Did You Know?
No.
No? Okay. Well, then we're going to get into our hot topic discussion. We're continuing our discussion of some of the different conflicts and wars our country's been in and paying tribute to the fallen soldiers. And help us with that, we have our guest, Robert Ford. He's been a friend of mine for over 15 years now. Guy's a person of integrity. He commands credibility. He retired as an Ohio middle school teacher after 30 years of his service. Bob, would you start us off with giving some insight about the Revolutionary War?
Sure, Greg. First of all, thanks for having me here today. Being a former social studies teacher, naturally I've always had a great interest in history, and in particular American history. And what I'd like to do this evening is just give a brief overview of some of the major conflicts that our country has been involved in, and the number of Americans that have sacrificed their lives so that we still have the freedoms that we do today. And the first war that I'd like to talk about is the American Revolution, or sometimes as it's referred to as the War for Independence. But to find out the reasons for the American Revolution being fought, we have to go back to 1754 during the French and Indian War. Back during this time period in the 1700s, over in Europe, France and Britain were constantly warring with one another. And a lot of what happened over in North America was just a continuation of the conflict between Britain and France. And basically, the French and Indian War was called the French and Indian War by the British because that's who they were fighting against. And it was fought over who controls land in the western part of the continent, and also some land in French Canada. And at the beginning, the colonists were having a hard time defending themselves against the French, so Britain stepped in and helped the colonists. And as a result of that, the colonists in Britain and some of their Indian allies were able to defeat the French and their Indian allies and basically drive France out of North America altogether. They were basically left after the Revolutionary War with just a little bit of land where Haiti is located at today. But a major outcome of this was the amount of money that it cost Great Britain to defeat the French in North America. And during this time period, the Americans that were living in the colonies, they were accustomed to being the least taxed people in the world at the time. And Britain decided that because this war had cost them a lot of money, that being that the colonists were still British subjects, that they were going to tax the colonists to help pay for the costs of the war. Well, the colonists had no problems with the taxes, but what the colonists were upset about is that they weren't being represented in British Parliament. Parliament is the lawmaking body of Great Britain, just like our Congress here is in the United States. And the colonists living in North America, not only were they not allowed to serve in Parliament, but they were also not allowed to vote for members of Parliament. And they felt that this was a big disservice. And maybe many of us are familiar with the phrase, no taxation without representation. And that was the basis for that. So in 1775, with the Battle of Lexington and Concord, that officially marked the beginnings of the Revolutionary War. And the fighting went on until September of 1783, when the Treaty of Paris was signed that officially ended the war, and the United States had gained their freedom from Great Britain. Another interesting thing to take note is that many folks think that with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, that the United States actually became free from Great Britain. But if we look at the timeline, that's not necessarily the case, because the Declaration was signed in 1776. And that's when the colonists officially declared their independence from Great Britain. They still had a war to fight in order to gain that independence. So with the ending of the Revolutionary War, the United States became its own separate country.
And what year was that, Bob?
1783.
1783, okay.
Yeah. The Treaty of Paris was signed on September 3rd of 1783, and that officially ended the Revolutionary War. Okay. And, another interesting stat that there were, 4,435 Americans who lost their lives in the Revolutionary War. And as I cover World War I and World War II, I'm going to go over the number of American casualties in those wars, because it's very important that we remember the number of people that have sacrificed so much so that we can have the freedoms that we do. And it's not only the men and women that actually served in the military, but it's also their families that had to deal with that. And that's not just talking about the soldiers that fought in the Revolutionary War or World War I or the Korean War or Vietnam. That's for members of the military that are serving today. They are sacrificing so much that too many of us in this country are simply taking for granted. And another thing to take note, too, that, if we go back to World War II and the Vietnam War, some of the people in those wars, they signed up voluntarily. Others were drafted. Okay, today's military, every single person in today's military volunteered. We have an all-volunteer military today. Okay, there's no draft. Those people willingly signed up to defend and protect our country. And those people deserve a great amount of respect for doing what they do.
Absolutely.
Greg?
Okay, well, I'm going to just give you some information about the Civil War. When did the Civil War happen? 1861 is when that war started, and it went until 1865. Who was involved? We had the Union, which was the North, versus the Confederacy, the South. And the states that were part of the Union included Maine, New York, New Hampshire, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, California, Nevada, and Oregon. And the president of the Union was Abraham Lincoln. The Confederacy, or the South, had the states of Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. to me, that I think of a lot of the SEC teams, right? When we think of football or competition with sports, their president was Jefferson Davis. We had other states, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Missouri. They were all called the border states. The enlistment strength, the Union, the North Army had 2,672,000 approximately in their army, and the Confederate, the South Army, had between 750,000 to 1.2 million. Why did this Civil War happen? There were multiple things mentioned. One was the states' rights. The southern states believed that states should have more power, not all to the federal government. Does that sound familiar with what's happening in today's day and age, right? Territorial expansion. The southern states wanted to expand into these new territories using slavery. The North did not want slavery. The election of Abraham Lincoln was another point they discussed. Lincoln was known as an abolitionist and was elected without one electoral vote from the South. Ultimately, the southern states decided to succeed, and that led to the Civil War. The North wanted one country, and the southern states did not want it that way because they didn't feel they were being represented properly. Fatalities, about 625,000 men died. More Americans died in this war than both world wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War combined. What were the results? The North wins, and ultimately we have one country right now. Bob, I think you were going to discuss a couple of the world wars next, right?
Yeah, I just want to touch briefly on World War I and World War II. Starting with World War I, World War I actually started a few years before the United States entered. World War I actually started in 1914 with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. And it wasn't until 1917 that the United States joined in the war. At the beginning of the war, President Wilson proclaimed neutrality for the United States. Best believe that the United States remain neutral and not take any sides in the fighting in this war. But the United States was also supplying both sides during this war, and eventually with Germany's continued sinking of American merchant ships in the British war zone around the British Isles, the United States eventually entered World War I. This was supposed to be the war to end all wars, and as we know, that wasn't the case. But eventually, the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire surrendered. And due to dwindling resources on the battlefield, discontent on the home front, so eventually the Central Powers, led by Germany, surrendered. Okay, and a lot of people feel that World War II was simply a continuation of World War I, with just a little break in between. And World War II, that started on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded the country of Poland. And once again, at the beginning of the war, the United States simply chose to remain neutral. They tried to stay out of the war, even though they were supplying our allies with supplies during this time period. But Japan became angry about sanctions that were being enforced by the United States. And on December 7th, 1941, they did a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, which they tried to take out our Pacific Fleet. And over 2,400 men and women perished during the attack on Pearl Harbor. And interestingly enough, this was one of the last times that the United States actually declared war on a country. The bombing took place in the morning of December 7th, and immediately following on December 8th, President Roosevelt went before Congress to ask for a declaration of war. And for those of you that may be wondering, the President of the United States does not have the power to declare war. That is a power that is left to Congress. And what the president needs to do is he needs to appear before Congress and ask for an official declaration. And it was almost by a totally unanimous vote that the U.S. Congress voted in favor of declaring war against Germany, Italy, and Japan. And just a little tidbit there was only one no vote to declare war, and that was by a representative from the state of Montana, Jeanette Rankin, who declared herself a lifelong pacifist. She was the only member of Congress to not vote in favor of war. So immediately after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the United States entered World War II. And on a personal note, my dad was 18 years old when the United States entered World War II. And he told me many stories, but it's been a number of years since he passed. And I wish I would have written them down and listened to him a lot longer when he wanted to talk about it. But being younger and dumber, I didn't. But I remember a couple of the stories that he told me, graduating from high school in June of 1942. In August of 1942, 2 months after he graduated, he received his draft card in the mail, where he had to report to a station in downtown Youngstown for a physical, and then from there he had to go to boot camp down in Mississippi. And after boot camp was over in Mississippi, they put them all on a ship, and they never told them where they were going. The ship went across the Atlantic, and they didn't know where they were at until they arrived in England. And during World War II, he fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He was also involved in the D-Day invasion at Normandy Beach. And I remember him telling me a story about what life was like on the front line. Being a history teacher, one of the things that we try to teach kids is that when you study history, there's two sources of information that you can use. You can use a primary source, that's a first-hand source, or a second-hand source. That's something like reading it from a textbook. Well, there's no source like a primary source. And what's sad is that each day we are losing veterans from World War II. And when we lose these veterans, we're actually losing an eyewitness to history. And I remember him telling me, being in the front line on the battlefield as an infantryman, at night you didn't get to go home to your camp and sleep in your bed. You had to sleep out on the battlefield, and they would dig holes in the ground. They were called foxholes. And you would share that foxhole with one other person. And he says sometimes guys just couldn't take the shooting going on at night with the artillery and so forth. And he said sometimes guys would just literally go berserk, and they'd jump out of their hole in the middle of the night, and they'd start running towards the forest where the Germans were at, firing their weapons, and the next thing you know, they were dead.
Wow.
And that's something that he had experienced as an 18, 19-year-old kid. And then something else that he told me at the end of the war, the infantry that he was in, one of their jobs was to go to a concentration camp and march these Jewish prisoners of war that were still in these camps back to their base. And he told me that they were marching them in double file lines down this country road. And when they passed a farm, some of them literally broke rank and killed a cow with their bare hands. And they just ate the meat right there, and they died, because their bodies just weren't used to food. And he says, the pictures that you see of these people in textbooks and so forth, he goes, yeah, that's exactly what they look like. They were nothing but skin and bones. And he witnessed that, as a 20-year-old man. And, the things that he saw in World War II, they affected him his entire life. I remember being younger, he would have nightmares still of the things that he saw and the things that, he witnessed during World War II. And interestingly enough, there were 16 million men and women that served in World War II, and there's only about 300,000 living today. And they are dying at a rate of about 370 each day. So, every day we're losing all of these eyewitnesses to history. And I think it's important that we remember that, and we try to learn about our past so that with these men and women dead, it does not get forgotten. Greg?
I agree. Great job, Bobby. Appreciate that. I want to mention some information about the Korean War, what happened there. That was back in the years 1950 through 1953. Who was involved? We had North Korea, the communist, against South Korea. Who was on North Korea's side? We had Russia, who provided supplies, and China, supplies and also men, and their military helped out. And that was against South Korea, who helped them. Mostly the U.S. did. A little bit of the United Nations partook in that too. Why did this war happen? You guys probably remember back from our other Bob we had in as a special guest telling some of the information about the Korean War and what stories he had to explain to us with what he went through as a young man. We got involved in the war in Korea to stop communism. We did not want the entire country of Korea to become a communist nation, and we helped the South fight that off, and were successful. Fatalities, there were 3 million war fatalities and a larger proportional civilian death toll than World War II or the Vietnam War. Approximately 37,000 American military were lost during combat, and an estimated 17,600 and some we lost with non-combat deaths. And again, I told you the result. North Korea was stopped from taking over South Korea, and the country remains split right now. What happened in the Vietnam War? That was back 1955, and it ran through 1975. About 2.7 million U.S. military served from 1964 through 1975. Who was involved? We had North Vietnam, the communists, versus South Vietnam. The North were supported by the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea, and the South were supported by the U.S., South Korea, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, and the Philippines. Why? The U.S. entered to stop the North Vietnamese from making Vietnam into a communist country altogether. You think about this, common theme. A lot of these wars were to do what? To stop communism, to make sure people had their freedoms left, right, or obtained. Fatalities, about 58,000 American troops died, as many as 2 million civilians on both sides, and some 1.1 million North Vietnamese and what they called Viet Cong fighters. The U.S. military estimates between 200 to 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers died in the war. What were the results? North Vietnam won this war initially, but after 17 years of misery under communist rule, again, misery is the key word, right? Communist rule. The country was broke, and they started to partner with the U.S. and allowed foreign investors to bolster their economy. And since 2004, I don't know if you knew this, but U.S. warships and the Vietnamese Navy have been doing joint exercises. Okay, the last couple wars or battles that we were in, Christina's going to help explain. Christina, did you want to get started with, I think you're going to start with the Gulf War?
Yes. So the Gulf War was January 17th, 1991. It was, the first phase was the Desert Shield, which was 43 days of air war. After that, February 24th, the Marines crossed the border. There was approximately 250 deaths as a result. And basically what it was is after Iran and Iraq War of the 1980s, Iraq was in debt to Kuwait and United Arabs who had financed its war efforts. The Iraqi president Saddam Hussein insisted both countries cancel that debt because he felt they owed him for protecting them against Iran. Both countries refused. However, so Hussein threatened Kuwait, its oil-rich, military-weak neighbor, resignating a decade-old border dispute over Kuwait itself. In July 1990, Saddam claimed that Kuwait and UAE were overproducing crude oil, driving down prices and depriving Iraq of critical oil revenues. He accused Kuwait of stealing from an oil field on the Iraq-Kuwait border, and he accused the U.S. and Israel of encouraging Kuwait to lower its oil prices. So it was basically a battle of oil and debts that he felt that he didn't owe. And then we go into the war in Afghanistan, which was October 7th, 2001. That was in response to the 9/11 attack on our World Trade Center. 2,350 troops approximately died. Over 20,092 were injured. And so that was basically in response to the terrorist attack, in which we all can remember that very well exactly where we were at that exact moment when the Twin Towers went down. The last one that I'm going to touch on is the War in Iraq, Operation Iraqi Freedom, which was March 20th, 2003. It was to change the Saddam regime from dictatorship and destroy weapons of mass destruction, free Iraqi people from the repressive regime. There was about 1,500 deaths due to that war. I don't have as much information as Bob. I really enjoyed that. I didn't used to really care much for history, and I really have gained a much interest since everything's been going on with this country, because I feel like they're trying to erase our history, and I want to know the truth behind it. So it was really good to have Bob give the information and actually getting the truth out there for people to know what's really going on and what happened in this country, to give us our freedoms. And like he says, we need to preserve those freedoms that all these men and women have fought, and a lot of them went in willingly to fight, and the respect that they have is not even close to what it should be. The younger generation has no idea what these people have gone through and what they continue to go through to help keep us free and safe.
I agree, and a lot of the youth out there, usually not to their fault, haven't been told of the true American history. And as we finish up here tonight, we want to pick Bob's brain a little bit about his experience working as a teacher in the Ohio public schools, and how that went for him and some of his beliefs going forward. So, Bob, wanted to ask you, how long was it that you did teach?
A little over 30 years.
And what subjects did you teach?
Over that 30-year period, I basically taught all subjects, but predominantly social studies. I taught math for a couple of years, language arts for a couple of years. But even during those years that I taught other subjects, I always taught social studies.
And that was your favorite to teach?
That's what I initially majored in college, was social studies, grades 7 through 12.
Bob, let me ask you the curriculum that you were sharing with the kids over the years. Did it end up changing dramatically or a little bit, or did it pretty much stay the same? How'd that?
Well, the biggest change, in my opinion, being a classroom teacher and being in the front lines, a lot of the changes came about when they started standardized testing. In 2011, basically all federal funding for civics and social studies was eliminated by the federal government. And even some states started to drop funding for civics and social studies. So that left, a lot of schools, especially the ones that were cash-strapped, that led a lot of schools to prioritize their curriculum around math and language arts, okay, because, it was tested every year, and that's where the federal dollars come from. And so who suffers from this? Social studies suffers from this. And a good example today, in the lower elementaries, like in grades 4 and 5 especially, social studies is not a standalone subject anymore. It's combined with language arts. Now, if you just think about it logically, if you're a classroom teacher and you're being evaluated every year, and a good part of your evaluation is based on how your kids do on these standardized tests, and you're teaching language arts and social studies, where are you going to focus most of your time? You're going to focus most of your time on language arts.
Right.
Social studies just basically gets swept under the rug. Not a whole lot of time is spent, especially in the lower levels, with social studies because it's not a tested area, okay? And that's really having a negative effect on, kids' knowledge of our country. It's not tested, so as a classroom teacher, it's common sense to say, hey, I'm not going to spend much time teaching social studies. My evaluation is not dependent on that. I'm going to focus on language arts or math. Okay, so that's probably one of the biggest changes, is the amount of time that has been taken away in subjects like social studies.
And in your opinion, why do you think that they made that change?
In my opinion, social studies is a lot more subjective. It's a harder subject area to test subjectively. Okay, whereas math, it's pretty objective. Language arts, it's pretty objective.
Right.
But social studies, it's in my opinion, it's not as objective of an area to measure as far as tests go.
So do you think there was any like underlying movement to try to get it to where there's a dumbing down of our youth to where they're not as equipped with the knowledge about the history of true America, to allow them to potentially sway America to become more of a part of a world economy instead of its own?
Yeah, I think there's some validity to that. I think you could attribute some of that where there may be people out there that want to downplay the role of the United States as far as their role in world history, and sort of clump everything together as the United States being, part of this global world where we're intertwined with the rest of the world, that we don't have our own sovereignty. And a good example of that is if you look at the curriculum in the state of Ohio, a fifth grade social studies curriculum, the concentration is the Western Hemisphere, okay? And it covers both North and South America, okay? And it just covers the early history of those two regions. So we don't even devote entire years, an entire school year with a curriculum just on U.S. history until you get, in fourth grade, they get a little bit of American history. And then in eighth grade, they get a little bit of they get American history, but it only goes from 1492 up to 1877. So it's not until high school where a student gets a chance to learn, about World War I, about World War II, about the Vietnam War, about the Korean War, about the war in Afghanistan. They don't get exposed to that information until they're in high school.
So if you were in charge of the curriculum, what would your opinion be on what would be most important for these kids to learn today?
Well, I think first and foremost, starting out at an early age, they should have a class on Ohio history. A separate class on Ohio history. I remember when I started teaching back in the 80s, seventh graders, they had a class just on Ohio history. That's all the class was about. And then in eighth grade, they had American history. And I remember at the time, you would start with, exploration, and then you would go to as far as you can cover. And I remember back then, we would usually make it up to and including the Vietnam War. Okay, so we got up to like the mid-70s back then. So, if I had my way, there would be a focus on Ohio history, and there would be a lot more focus, especially in grades 5, 6, and 7, on American history. I don't think that kids should have to wait until they're in high school to get a full course on World War I or World War II.
I agree.
And another thing, that really saddens me that, 2 days ago was the 77th anniversary of the D-Day invasion, okay, in which 2,500 Americans lost their lives on that day. And the President of the United States failed to even mention that day.
Yep.
On the 77th anniversary.
Yep.
It's like we just want to try to erase our history like it never happened. Well, that's not the case. It did happen.
Yes.
And by taking down statues and burning flags, that's not going to erase our history.
Nope.
But we have to make sure that we do our part in getting people to stand for America's history and make sure that our schools are teaching what needs to be taught. And if they're not going to, we have to pick up that baton, and we have to make sure that we're teaching our kids. We have to make sure we inform them.
Well, unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen because most families have both parents working and they're barely getting dinner on the table. So what I think needs to happen is parents need to start getting heavily involved, as I've said before, in their local school district and being involved in finding out what the curriculum is. And if it's not what you are paying your tax dollars for your kids to learn, then you need to make changes and you need to fight for those changes. The schools work for us. We pay the taxes. Therefore, we should have a say and demand a say in what our kids are learning in school. Simple as that.
Okay. Bob, was there any other thoughts you had concerning, the curriculum or your experience working as a teacher that you'd like to share with us, or just your overall opinion on how things have been affecting our country?
Well, I think one of the greatest disservices to happen was this remote learning. I think that set these kids back a lot.
I agree.
And I don't think you're going to have a summer program that is going to allow these kids to catch up on all that they missed by supposedly learning from home. Most of the teachers that I know that had to go through this remote learning said it's a complete failure. You know, the kids need to be in the classroom, and they're so much more than, you know, reading, writing, and arithmetic when you're in school. You know, it's about dealing with other people and learning how to get along with other people. And by kids staying at home in front of a computer, they're not developing the social skills that they're going to need to succeed in life. So I think with this remote learning, I think it set these students back a lot. And I feel sorry for a lot of these kids that had to endure that. You know, mom and dad's job, they can help only so much. You know, they can only help so much, especially when it comes to subjects like math. But once you start getting into the upper grades, a lot of times the parents can't help their kids with math. They need a teacher. And I don't know how you teach math from behind a computer screen. I don't do it. You have to be in there. It has to be hands-on. So I think, you know, recently that's been a real downfall with education is going to that remote learning.
Absolutely.
Well, let's transition into our third segment, our final segment, a lot of what we believe is probably the most important segment, and that's our Bible verse. Christina?
Yeah, so I was talking to one of my Did You Knows about the Virginia teacher that was suspended for refusing to affirm trans identities. And along with that, I was very disappointed, as I have been lately, in Disney. Disney is just as corrupt as everybody else these days, and they're really pushing the gender fluid agenda. And their new Disney movie, it's the Marvel supervillain Loki is supposedly gender fluid. That was according to Daily Wire, had that out. And it's so frustrating to me because according to the Bible and according to facts, we don't change our gender. We are born either a male or a female. It's just so ridiculous that they're trying to literally influence the children to have to even think about in grade school, am I a boy or a girl? That should never be a thought that's ever in a child's mind. And it's very frustrating to me. And the Bible clearly states in Genesis 1:26-27, then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, the livestock, over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in his own image. God created him male and female. He created them. That's what the Bible says. So if you believe in the Bible, and if you don't, either way, a male is a male and a female is a female. I wish this whole gender fluid thing would come to an end. And I really wish that parents, once again, would get involved in their schools. And if your schools are teaching this, go to the board meetings and do not allow it, because it's confusing these kids' little minds. The minds of the kids today are getting totally confused, and we're gonna have a whole generation of just kids that need mental assistance because they're gonna be very confused adults. And it's very annoying to me. It's unnecessary, and parents need to put a stop to it. So that's what my Bible verse is. So if you know anybody that is into the gender fluid, show them that in the Bible, and it's very clear. It's black and white right there in the Bible. God says it. So I'm going to go ahead and go into the prayer, and I wanted to do, before I did that, I wanted to thank Bob so much for coming and giving us an education. And
Thanks for having me.
a lot of people are learning this stuff for the first time, unfortunately, but we really appreciate you coming in. Lord, we just thank you so much for the brave men and women that you gave the courage to go in combat and fight for our country and fight for our freedoms. And we thank you for people like Bob that had an interest in that went out and got an education and learned about the wars that we have been in throughout the years, and is able to educate the younger generation so that they're aware of all of these things. And we're thankful for people like Bob's father that fought for our country. And we are just so grateful for living in this wonderful country. And we just ask God we ask you, Lord, to just give us the protection that you've always shown on us and give us grace. In Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, and next week, I think we talked about giving more of a hot topic discussion having to do with human trafficking. Isn't that right, Christina?
Yes, the human trafficking is $1 billion industry in this country, and this immigrant thing is just making it even more money, trafficking in all these kids that are coming over here without any parents, and what an easy access it is for these sex traffickers to be standing at the borders just taking these kids in, and these kids are thinking they're coming here, and something that needs to be addressed. And Trump was doing an excellent job at putting an end to sex trafficking, and all the bills that he passed are currently being completely demolished, unfortunately.
Okay, so we'll finish up our broadcast tonight. We appreciate everybody's time. We look forward to talking with you next week.